Poor St. Thomas. He gets a bad rap even from his brother Apostle John in our Gospel today. He's been dubbed Doubting Thomas ever since, pilloried for his lack of faith, his failure to accept the testimony of his friends. The impression given is that while the rest of the apostles were men of great faith, Tom was the odd one out. The truth, however, is not so simple. The first point I'd make in Thomas's defence is that the other apostles were every bit as hard-hearted and boneheaded when it came to Jesus' predictions that he would rise from the dead, or the Mary's testimony that he had indeed risen. Secondly, if Thomas is to be blamed for insisting that seeing is believing, the other guys were just as guilty of refusing to believe until they'd seen the Lord for themselves. When they first told Thomas that Jesus had risen, they didn't say, "We've heard the Lord is around," from the women. No, they told him, "We have seen the Lord, seen him with our own eyes, and that's why we believe." And when Thomas sees, he too believes. Indeed, he utters on their behalf and ours the great creed and prayer, "My Lord and my God." Thirdly, our gospel today tells us that the apostles were hiding in a locked room for fear of the Jews. Thomas, on the other hand, was out and about, not half so intent on hiding his allegiance to Jesus as the others were. Perhaps he had rather more courage than his companions, and faith in Jesus' power to defend him against persecution and death. But fourthly, and most importantly, having Christian faith is not the same as being gullible. If people tell you they've seen a ghost, you shouldn't just accept their word for it. God gave us intelligence so we would test everything, and not just believe the latest rumour or most fashionable opinion. When Our Lady was given the news that she would conceive the Son of God, her immediate response was not to say, "Wow, sure thing, you beaut." No, her immediate response was to interrogate the angel about how this could be, given that she was a virgin. Thomas, then, is rightly wary about group hysteria and wishful thinking, and so he asks for some evidence. So why does the Lord seem to humiliate Thomas by inviting him to put his fingers and hands into his wounds? For this reason, perhaps. While many of the Jews believed in the resurrection of the just, the Pharisees amongst them, it was not clear that this meant literal resurrection in some corporeal, bodily form. There were liberal theologians and Fairfax commentators, then as now, ready to say that resurrection is really about someone living on in our hearts or in their achievements, but not about anything so crass as rising in the flesh. What Jesus is doing today, it seems, is in inviting Thomas's touch, is insisting that he really did rise. Not as a ghost, an apparition, not as wishful thinking or an inspiring idea, but literally in the body. And it was the fingers of doubters ever since, including of doubting modernity, that he was inviting into the wounds in his hands and side. So let's be clear about this, all of us. Christian faith is faith that Christ rose from the dead in the body. The same Christ who walked in Galilee and was crucified and died in Jerusalem, later met his disciples again in Jerusalem and cooked breakfast again for them in Galilee. And he did so not as some kind of magic trick or to show off how powerful he was, but so we might have confidence that we too will transcend the grave, that we too will be raised up. Now, for such of us to rise less than bodily would be an impoverishment, indeed vandalism, and God is no vandal. If it is to be truly us who are raised, us who live after, we must rise in our bodies. Life beyond the grave could only be a truly blessed life for us if we are to be all we properly are now and more, not less. Through his encounter with Thomas, Jesus shows us that that is exactly what he has won for us. Next comes Jesus' last beatitude. He's already taught us that blessed are the poor and poor in spirit, the meek and mournful, the hungry and those who feed them, the thirsty for justice and those who quench, the pure and the merciful, the persecuted and peacemaker, those unoffended by him, those who hear the word of God and do it, those still doing it when he comes. Jesus also beatified the eyes that see what you see and the ears that hear what you hear. And now we hear his last beatitude. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. Faith, it seems, goes beyond what can be known by sensory perception and reason alone. It opens the eyes of the mind to something greater. In the 1994 Christmas comedy film The Santa Claus, Scott Calvin, played by Tim Allen, is an ordinary man who accidentally injures Santa on Christmas Eve. To make amends, he is required to go to the North Pole, see the elves at work, and take on Santa's mantle for that year. When he encounters a polar bear directing traffic, he declares, "I see it, but I don't believe it." To which his young elven guide responds, Seeing isn't believing. Believing is seeing. The point is, Scott has so many preconceptions about how the world is or should be that he can't believe what's right before him. He's like Pilate in that, or the Pharisees, or Thomas. Seeing isn't enough for him to understand. He needs to believe in order to see the truth. Sometimes a leap of faith is required in order to see what is right in front of us. Our Easter leap of faith is this: that one man has come back, not as a projection of the faith of his disciples, for he came when none of them had the least idea of such a possibility, and all of them had a strong disinclination to believe it. One man has come back, not as a ghostly phenomenon, a spiritual experience, a happy memory, but in flesh and blood. One man has come back, and while we do not see him yet with our eyes, we do with our hearts, and we shall indeed see him face to face when we are at last filled with joy by the divine mercy. Easter Church of Sydney, 175 years young, believe that you might see.